Imagine this. June 4th, 1944. In the Atlantic Ocean, about 150 miles west of Cape Blanco, Africa, 58 German submariners burst to the surface of the icy waters. Their hands were in the air in surrender. Their submarine, crippled and flooding, was sinking beneath them. They were stranded in enemy waters, surrounded by American warships. Many of them believed they would either be gunned down where they floated or dragged aboard for a brutal interrogation that might end in execution. What they didn't realize was that history was about to be made. These men had just become the first enemy naval crew captured at sea by the U.S. Navy since the War of 1812. But what their captor, Captain Daniel Gallery, chose to do next stunned even these hardened veterans. His actions didn't just change the fate of these 58 Germans, it altered the course of naval history and became one of World War II's most extraordinary stories of honor in the middle of total war. This is not the story you think it is. Stay with me, because by the end, you'll understand why one German officer later said this event restored his faith in humanity, right in the midst of the world's bloodiest conflict. But the real shock was yet to come. To understand the importance of this moment, you need to know what a U-boat meant in 1944. The German submarine U-505 had been terrorizing Allied shipping for nearly 2 years. Every ship she sent to the bottom carried more than supplies. It carried soldiers' letters to their families, photographs of children, medicine for field hospitals, and food for liberated people in starving territories. A single strike wasn't just military action, it shattered dozens of families. By 1944, submarine warfare had become brutally unforgiving. German U-boats were under direct orders to attack any Allied vessel, often without warning. In turn, Allied ships rarely bothered to rescue survivors. They destroyed U-boats on sight. The old codes of gentlemanly naval warfare had long been abandoned. It was in this savage climate that our story takes place. But the real shock was yet to come. The man at the center of it all was Captain Daniel Gallery, an Irish-American from Chicago. He was sharp, calculating, and bold enough to challenge convention. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood, he had learned that your word mattered more than rules on paper, and treating people fairly was a point of pride. By 1943, Gallery commanded Task Group 22.3, which included his escort carrier USS Guadalcanal and 5 destroyer escorts. Their mission? Hunt U-boats in the Atlantic. But Gallery had an impossible idea in his head. He didn't just want to sink U-boats, he wanted to capture one intact. That hadn't been done since the War of 1812. His superiors thought he was out of his mind. German submarines were built to sink themselves quickly if damaged, and crews were ordered to scuttle their vessels rather than let them be taken. But Gallery drilled his men anyway. 8 months later, against all odds, his gamble was about to pay off. What followed in the next few minutes stunned both sides. Meanwhile, U-55 was enduring the worst patrol of her career. In October 1943, during a fierce depth charge attack, her commander, Captain Lieutenant Peter Zetch, broke under the pressure. In full view of his crew, he pulled out his pistol and shot himself in the head rather than face capture. The shocking suicide devastated morale, and many sailors became convinced their submarine was cursed. But June 1944, the new commander, Harold Lang, 40 years old and one of the oldest U-boat captains, was struggling. He was inexperienced with U-55 and under enormous pressure. For 2 months at sea, his crew hadn't sunk a single Allied ship. Supplies were running low, exhaustion was setting in, and morale was collapsing. What Lange didn't know was that Gallery's task group was closing in. On the morning of June 4th, Lieutenant William T. Tolan, flying a Grumman TBF Avenger, spotted something suspicious at 11:09 a.m. The unmistakable shadow of a submarine moving beneath the waves. He launched a depth charge attack that crippled U-505,
damaging her controls and power systems. Launch had to choose: stay submerged and risk losing the boat entirely, or surface immediately. At 11:15 a.m., U-505 burst from the depths like a wounded whale, water gushing from her hull and smoke pouring into the sky. Her crew scrambled in panic. On the bridge of the Guadalcanal, Gallery realized this was the moment he had been preparing for. Instead of ordering his ships to destroy the sub with gunfire, he gave the command: "Away all boats, we're going to board her." But none of the Americans knew they were racing against time. Among the Germans abandoning ship was Petty Officer Gottfried Fischer, tasked with setting the charges that would blow the submarine apart. In his panic, he made a critical error. He set the timer for 7 minutes instead of 30 seconds. That mistake gave the Americans a slim chance to act. The real challenge, however, had only just begun. Leading the boarding party was Lieutenant Albert of the USS Pillsbury. At just 23 years old, David volunteered to climb aboard the smoking, half-sinking U-505, a mission that looked like suicide. With radioman Stanley Wadowiak and signalman Arthur Nispel, he rowed across and climbed onto the damaged sub. Inside, water was flooding compartments, fires crackled, and the ominous ticking of the charges echoed. David and his men pressed forward. They shut valves to stop the flooding and even managed to locate and disable the explosives. One wrong move, and they would all have been blown apart. Within an hour, U-505 was stabilized and taken under tow. For the first time in over a century, the U.S. Navy had captured an enemy warship on the high seas.
But the real test was only beginning. What happened afterward would remain a secret for decades. Inside U-505, the Americans found a treasure trove: codebooks, charts, technical manuals, and most importantly, an Enigma machine with the day's settings still in place. It was an intelligence jackpot that could save thousands of Allied lives. But there was a problem. If Germany discovered U-505 had been captured, they would immediately change all their codes. Gallery now faced another impossible question: what to do with 58 German prisoners who knew exactly what had happened? The Germans themselves expected execution. Lang later wrote that he was sure his crew would be killed. But what happened instead shocked everyone. Rather than being treated as criminals, the German sailors were pulled from the sea, given medical treatment, dry clothes, and warm food. Gallery had made a radical choice: to treat them not as enemies to be brutalized, but as fellow sailors who had fought honorably. It was a move both humane and strategically brilliant. To keep the intelligence haul secret, the Germans had to disappear. Gallery arranged for them to be quietly moved to Camp Ruston, Louisiana, under cover stories that they were captured in North Africa. There, the Germans lived in clean barracks, received regular meals, earned wages, and were allowed recreation. They remained isolated from other POWs for the rest of the war. Ironically, this respectful treatment made them more cooperative. Many provided technical details willingly, not because of torture, but out of gratitude for being treated decently. Meanwhile, the Enigma machine, charts, and manuals from U-505 gave the Allies priceless insight into German naval strategy. The capture of U-505 didn't just save lives, it proved that honor could exist even in total war. For the Americans involved, it was the most meaningful event of their service, not because they seized an enemy ship, but because they showed humanity when it mattered most. For the Germans, it was transformative. They had been taught to see Americans as savages. Instead, they were treated with dignity. Commander Lang lived until 2003. often saying that Captain Gallery's decision restored his faith in human decency. When U-505 was moved to Chicago in 1954 as a museum exhibit, German veterans, including former U-boat sailors, volunteered to help preserve it. Enemies in war became partners in peace.
Captain Daniel Gallery had every reason to sink U-505 and let her crew drown. That would have been standard practice. But instead, he chose a path of courage and conscience. His decision didn't just save 58 lives or hand the Allies invaluable intelligence. It showed that victory achieved with honor is greater than victory achieved with cruelty. In humanity's darkest hour, Gallery proved that individuals can still choose dignity over brutality. So, think about this. If your family has stories from World War II, moments when honor triumphed over hate, when enemies showed compassion, or when ordinary people made extraordinary moral choices, share them. Because these stories remind us that decency is not bound to one nation or one generation. It lives on whenever we choose to see even our enemies as human beings worthy of respect, even in the midst of the most terrible war in history.